Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Adam Dick, Science Advisor with the Canadian Wood Fibre Centre of the Canadian Forest Service. Hopefully I got that right, Adam.
Yep, you got it.
Awesome. So what's shaking in your world? Where are we reaching you today?
I'm in my basement in Fredericton, New Brunswick. So the CFS has multiple centers across the country. Fortunate that Fredericton is one, so I don't have to go far from home.
Absolutely. And what's the latest state out there? Things are like in Ottawa here, lockdown.
Yeah, we're in pseudo lockdown. They said we'd go till the end of the week, but things aren't turning around. So it wouldn't surprise me if we kept in this mode for a while. So
yeah. Did you ever go back into the office at some point? Did they reopen it? Because you guys,
no.
East Coast was a bit better with COVID.
The thing is, we could have gone back, but everything is kind of dictated out of Ottawa. So as long as things aren't improving in Ottawa, they and fair enough. It's hard to micromanage, what's going on in this center every day. And when they think of remote field work in Ottawa, they might think of a geologist going into a remote northern Indigenous community. So there's a lot of reason to be cautious about how we move around and stuff. So.
Yeah. So in Ottawa, and your reference is the government. I live in Ottawa, so of course we're the center of the universe. Everybody knows that. It's not Toronto, but I'm just joking, of course. But so it was kind of funny. I was thinking the last time we saw. I always do this on a lot of the podcasts, and some people are like, "Why do you do this?" Because I'm like, I don't know. I kind of like to know when the last time I traveled and who I saw. But in this case, visiting you guys out in Fredericton for that AI workshop in February 2020.
Yeah, we're
my
just
last trip.
Was that your last time in a plane?
Last time in a tin cup. Yep, that was it. Heading to Freddie to meet with you guys.
Yeah, no, that was almost 2 years ago. I went to Toronto a couple of weeks after that for the last AWARE meeting, and things were a little bit surreal in hindsight. Going back to the airport and last trip on a plane too. So
yeah, it's crazy. And we'll talk more about where and other research programs. So customary with this podcast is getting to know you, your background in forestry, how you came to be. So maybe tell our listeners, how'd you get into forestry?
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways forestry runs in the family. I have a grandfather who turns 97 next month, and he graduated from Maritime Forest Ranger School in 1948. He was the third class out of there. I've got an uncle who went through the forestry program at UNB, including a master's. He and I had offices next door to one another when I worked with the province. And then I went through the program, did a master's and an undergrad at UNB in forestry. And I've got three cousins who have recently completed the program or wrapping up. So
no kidding.
It runs deep in the family.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious because I didn't go to school in forestry, but I've discovered, I won't say rivalry, but maybe pedigree in terms of some of the different forestry schools. Yeah. Any ever thoughts of, heading west, UBC or U of A, I don't even know U of T, but leaving the maritime region, or was it always kind of clear to you, you know what, I'm gonna focus on forestry out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Fredericton, and you kind of grow up embedded in, there's a lot of forestry activity, obviously, in New Brunswick. So, you see it embedded within the work you do, and obviously having relatives who are in the sector. So never really saw the reason to, if I were going to do forestry, it was going to be to work in the forest sector in New Brunswick. So during my master's program, I had the opportunity to do the UBC Fall Field Camp up near Williams Lake 1 year. And that was very, that was educational in terms of taking what I had learned in New Brunswick and putting it into a different context, and seeing what is readily translatable. Obviously the species are different, but in terms of silviculture, things like that. And I worked a summer in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan during my undergrad too. So I've not completely been in New Brunswick, but
for sure. good old Waskesiu neck of the woods up there in
Exactly.
PA. Nice area. My wife's from just outside Regina, so that's summer stomping grounds, and
There you go.
love it. Good old Boreal. Not that many people around, which again, check for this guy. And the liquor beer store is about 50 meters away from the cabin. So triple check, and
Perfect.
and all good. So maybe tell for our listeners, share. I know some of this. Obviously, I've known you for several years, but for our listeners, tell me more about that career. You're in the federal side of things now, but at one point was provincial. Then you also had like other. So maybe kind of lay that path from you finished UMB school, then obviously chose or maybe decided not to do more grad school, but you kind of went into industry. Maybe kind of share with us that progression, and did it kind of go the way you expected?
Yeah. I guess in hindsight, I guess I'm where I want to be, but it has been a bit of a circuitous route. So I finished, actually it'd be 20 years in the spring when I finished my undergrad. I did that in 2002, and was going to go work for industry. And then just as the year was wrapping up, Dave McLean, who's a professor, was the dean at the time at UMB, approached me and said he had an internship, I guess, to do GIS work within his research lab. So I actually took that. So that was the first fortunate, in choosing your path, I guess that was the first fortunate one. So within about 2 weeks of starting a GIS internship, he came to me and said, actually, we're starting a whole bunch of field work up in Blackbrook, and we need someone to run the field work. So can you go do that? So I ended up in Blackbrook, staying in camp for the first summer, collected a lot of data for a master's student that had yet been identified, but the field work had to start. So did that for a summer and started analyzing the data. And then, Dave hadn't found a master's student yet. So I kind of said, well, maybe I'm the candidate. So started part-time doing my master's at UNB. And then there was at the time there was a integrated forest management lab that was being established at UNB. And so I got a contract to kind of run the day-to-day operations of that lab, and work on contract work, do analytical work at the same time. That lasted 3 years, still doing the master's part-time. That contract was up, and the growth and yield unit position came up in New Brunswick. So the person, really the single person working on growth and yield in New Brunswick, and coordinating it was interesting. It was a shared position between government and industry. So, you had to be very objective, see both sides of the coin, and, really be rigorous in the information and the results you were presenting, because both sides wanted, you're taking their side, you're taking their side. Why are you?
Right.
So that was really interesting. Got into digging into data, inventory data, and really part of it too was it was really the first time where, we started having that conversation of New Brunswick has a strategic level, photo interp based forest inventory where we get stratum averages, big numbers, maybe works so for doing strategic forest management planning over the long term, but once you start getting into forest operations, it wasn't enough. And so starting on the side, that dialogue about, when this inventory cycle comes up, what do we want to do next?
What year was that when that dialogue was starting, Adam?
So that was the I guess we're almost actually at the last end of the current 10-year cycle. It would have been around 2010, 2011. To figure out what was going to happen in 2013 for the next inventory cycle. Was kind of where those discussions were happening. And so part of that, I transitioned from the growth and yield unit into provincial government formally, and really started working in the inventory group. And really, I don't think it was ever formally tasked to me, but I kind of, with my get up and go, kind of took the leadership on it, and starting to facilitate that discussion on what the future inventory, what we wanted to look like, what we needed for attributes, and then kind of scanning the world and seeing what was out there as opportunities. And that's where, Murray Woods and Doug Pitt and all of those folk came in and the Canadian Wood Fibre Centre, who were working hard doing case studies in Ontario on enhanced forest inventory, the use of lidar for high resolution, your 20-meter cell inventory. I think you were one of the co-authors on a paper came out of Ontario on the development of an operational forest inventory for Boreal Ontario. I can't remember the exact title, but I remember the day of seeing that paper came out, and I went to folks within the forest inventory section. I said, this is what we're going to do for the next forest inventory cycle. And that started really a big sprint of, okay, this looks promising in Ontario. We've got a different forest condition in New Brunswick. It's more complex. There's other criteria we want to make sure we can satisfy. How are we going to convince ourselves that that's the approach we want to take? And so again, going back to, kind of the forestry community around Fredericton and New Brunswick, and, having the federal government, the Canadian Forest Service here in Fredericton, and particularly an important asset is the Acadia Research Forest outside of Fredericton.
Right. Yeah.
And we realized that there was already a lidar capture at Acadia Research Forest, and that was made available to us. And basically the winter of 2012, we went out there every day and got on snowmobiles and put in a whole bunch of inventory plots and collected a bunch of data. And then I dove right into it. It was made aware of fusion. Didn't really want to have to take the time to figure all that out. So I just started coding everything up in R and basically wanted to replicate what was done in that Ontario paper. And by spring, we were able to do that at Acadia. I remember Doug coming down in the spring, and and Murray were both there, and maybe Murray wasn't there, but presenting our results, and was very happy. I'd done first, take the equations out of the Ontario paper and just directly apply them to New Brunswick. How transferable are they? And then start building it myself. And things look positive. Yeah. And so that's really what got things rolling. We went through the procurement process to, start getting the lidar acquisition, finding a solution provider, and so on. At that point, we didn't have the budget, so we were kind of working with we'll take the inventory, the solution provider, keep the lidar on the shelf, and maybe we'll come back to get the lidar. Eventually, we'll find other government departments who see a need for it. But really, our focus was getting that forest inventory. We did 700,000 hectares in 2013 in the first year. And really, the snowball kept rolling, bringing in the partners. We started at one point data acquisition, planning to do that over a 10-year cycle. Then we started bringing in, as I said, other government departments. We received additional funding from the province, as well as from the federal government, because we started making those connections on the other non-forest sectors and their needs. So we got money from the Climate Change Adaptation Fund to look at coastal erosion and things like that. All that to say is we went from 2013 starting, let's just get the inventory, 1 point per square meter acquisition, to getting more funds, accelerating that program to the point where by 2018, we had all of New Brunswick covered with lidar and enhanced forest inventory, including going back to the original blocks that were done at 1 point, recapture those at 6 points. We have a 6 point capture over all of New Brunswick and enhanced forest inventory. And I'd say still working with the sector to try to figure out how they're going to best take advantage of all that new information. That next paradigm shift of, I've got this great input of data, but how does that change my decision tools, and what do I do with that data to really capture the value that's within it?
Yeah. So what a journey there. And so lots there. I know there's different names. So for our listeners, Murray Woods worked at Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, whatever, different names at different times. Yeah. And Dr. Doug Pitt worked at with Canadian Wood Fibre Centre as well. Exactly. And so a small community at the end of the day. And it's really cool to hear the synergies, the different players coming together to realize something new. But one thing that struck me was when you said, you started using Fusion. So again, for our listeners, U.S. Forest Service, open source, I think it's open source piece of software for data processing for forestry. And then you coded it in R. For a minute, and for our listeners, our foresters, a statistical modeling, again, open source environment there. But for a minute, I was in my head going like, oh, great. Well, it's so good you went to computer science or something technical in undergrad. And yeah, it was forestry. So where do those skill sets come? Because not everyone, just grabs and go, yeah, I'm going to write my own script and stuff. Obviously, there's an element technical literacy there. Where'd that come from?
Well, so actually, when I've recently had the discussion with the forestry faculty at UNB. When I completed my undergrad, I actually did a computer applications minor alongside of it, which was, I would say, sort of basic. Heavy focus on GIS. I would say, we picked up. I took a course in Java, a lot of GIS. We went to the geomatics department to take courses on projections and things like that. Coding really was picking it up on the job and just understanding that that was a tool that I was going to need to answer some of my questions. Now, as I said, I'm 20 years on from my undergrad, and I met with the dean and the acting dean at UNB Forestry before Christmas. And, I said, I'm curious, what does that, obviously things have changed over 20 years. What does that computer applications minor look like today? And the program's changed. They've split it off a little bit. It had gone from a 5-year program. Currently it's a 4-year program. They don't offer that minor anymore. And we all kind of said, okay, that's something that we need to focus on and figure out, today, what would that computer applications minor look like? What kind of tools, what does the digital forester need to be able to do their job, right?
Absolutely.
So that's something over the next year. I think, I'm not going to provide that reply to them. I'm going to try to convene a set of stakeholders from the forest sector and figure out what kind of skill sets they need as they go, as they're hiring and recruiting into their workplaces.
Yeah, that's an awesome initiative. Yeah, because as we know, our kids are similar in age. They're learning these coding skills. Like my eldest is coding right now, and she's 11 years old. And when she shows me her slide deck, I'm like, wow, how did you do that? And she looks at me like, what do you mean, Dad? It's like, this is like so easy. And then she's like, where did you learn? And I said, oh, Dad actually had an undergraduate course on how to make slides, markers on the acetates with a projector, and PowerPoint was like this new thing, right? And then she just kind of gave me this look of like, how old are you? Like, holy cow, I didn't think you're that old. I'm like, well, I'm not that old, but that was the time. So the skills are going to change. So I think that would be an awesome initiative. And that connects the dots in the sense of, you being able to do that technical, more comp side because you were already exposed to it and it wasn't something scary. It almost sounds like it was a natural progression of, I got a problem, so I'm going to use my skills to tackle it. Yeah, very cool. Very cool. So we think about, so obviously from our listeners listening, describe that journey. We've heard the buzzword lidar. We've heard some changes in point density, different players and whatnot. What was maybe some of the fear or uncertainty? Because again, you were in a government environment, like a public environment. So even when we think about digital transformation or even change in general in private sector, that's scary enough. So we move into a public space, that hats off to you for like getting that off the ground, because there's a lot of players and we can all read between the lines what that means. But what were some of that FUD, I guess, that fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the early days as you're trying to get this off? Because you obviously had a vision on where you saw things could go. But what were some of those impediments that you bumped into early on that some of our listeners might actually benefit from hearing and understanding how you overcame some of those typical objections?
So, I mean, obviously working in a government environment, you're given a fixed budget every year, and you're lucky if it stays constant over time. It's more likely to go down than go up over time. And so we had a fixed budget for forest inventory. And as I said, our first endeavor into it, we realized two things. If we waited for everything to fall in place, we'd still be here today waiting for our first lidar scan over the province. Right.
Good point.
And we realized that our mandate was forest inventory. And so that's what we had to focus on. And so, as I said, that's why when we initially began, we said, okay, we've convinced ourselves it's going to work for forest inventory. We're ready to take that leap. We can at our budget level get an inventory produced. So we just started and ran with it. And then in parallel, once we were going, started to build those coalitions within government to say, go to Department of Environment and say, lidar is an amazing tool to start looking at, better delineating streams. There were a few big 100-year floods on the St. John River, flooded downtown Fredericton. Okay, you want to figure out, if the river exceeds flood level by 3 meters, where is it going to go? What is it going to impact? LiDAR is a great tool for that. And so we just started building those case studies, going to NGOs, watershed groups within the province, Department of Transportation. We also worked with our other provincial colleagues. So the Quebec government, for example, has done a great report going, they analyzed department by department, sort of what would be the economic benefit of acquiring LiDAR and what would be your quantified savings. And then, I don't remember the specific numbers, but, they concluded for every dollar you invested LiDAR, you saw $1.50 in returns or what have you.
Minimum.
So,
yep.
Yeah. And so, yeah, kind of, while we were focused on the forest inventory mandate, work in parallel to make those, build that coalition that was going to get us all the LiDAR data. Obviously, has, the raw LiDAR and the, depth of water table mapping and elevation and all of that, for forest operations provides a whole bunch of other benefits that are going to yield that return on investment. But
yeah,
we
that's
just
so smart.
We're the forest inventory shop where we can get a forest inventory that's LiDAR derived at our budget. Let's go. And, frankly, we made some people upset that we had gone first because, within their department, they were putting together these big strategic plans for LiDAR for the province, right? And, I wouldn't say they didn't stop talking to us, but that was really, we were pushing people along when we had to bring them to the table and get us to the point where we were at. So
yeah, for sure. Well, it sounds like you guys were more in the doing mode and making friends and building alliances than maybe those around the table talking and strategizing and
but there's a lot of these things, even today, folks will say, well, the volume predictions aren't exactly where we want them to be in the enhanced forest inventory. But, had we not started back then, we wouldn't even known that and then understand where incrementally we need to make those improvements and do that work.
Yeah. So let's run off that. That's a great segue. So maybe for our listeners, tell us about the New Brunswick wall-to-wall EFI, the metrics that were modeled, and then connect the dots in that last statement where you say some folks are like, well, it's not that good. It's not good enough. And then what's your response to that? And then what work's going into address that?
Yeah. So, so the province of New Brunswick, I guess, at the 6-point level between 2015 and 2018 would kind of be the bookends of sort of the inventory that's currently available at 6 point per square meter. Obviously predicting height, basal area, quadratic mean diameter. The other things we did to kind of reduce our cost were, we were very specific on what we wanted to get from the vendor and then hand over to us and what we could do in-house. So basically anything that was measured in a plot with a pair of calipers or a hypsometer to measure a height, that's what we got from the vendor. When it came to volume, those things, we developed an internal approach to figure those out ourselves. So it saved us cost on one hand. The other thing is, as product specs change over time and markets and all of that, that's something that internally we could refresh and update and not have to go back to a raw point cloud to be able to update our net merchantable volume predictions the moment or our percent of saw log once our upper stem diameter limit got changed or something like that, our merchantability spec. So those were the things that we were able to change. The reality is, once you get to volume on an enhanced forest inventory, in most cases, you're still using empirical equations that are derived off of data that, might have been collected years ago in another jurisdiction. It's not going to be precise enough at that local resolution, right? And So we need to think of another approach. I co-developed the taper equations for New Brunswick in 2009. We did a bunch of stem analysis and plantations in New Brunswick, and Aaron Weiskettel at University of Maine got Honer's. Honer's equations are kind of the standard equations in Eastern Canada. He reanalyzed all of Honer's raw data with some, nonlinear mixed effects models, took a different approach, and same data, but saw an improvement. But still, plantations in New Brunswick is an important basket of volume. And, we sampled 1,000 trees to describe every tree that we're going to harvest. Obviously, it's not enough data. So, part of, if we want to get into the workshop that we held 2 years ago and, looking at big data and artificial intelligence, and really, it's transformed into, terms around forest value chain optimization and digitalization, is really starting to get into what are the, what does that digital supply chain look like? What quantities and types of data do we need along there to help people make decisions? At the front end of it, at the, literally at the stump, is harvester head data. That is one data set that, was identified at the workshop. I think everyone, had seen examples of how it had been used. No one, I would say, is really using it in New Brunswick yet, but we saw merit, and we saw complementary merit to that enhanced forest inventory. Particularly, I have an operational block, and my enhanced forest inventory with a bunch of assumptions gives me what my likely volume is there. We've always kept that on one side, and then what I actually got roadside was held in another database. And they never kind of, you anecdotally complained that they never matched each other, but you never connected them. Tried to make that loop to make some incremental improvements, right?
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's just everyone's too busy and never connected the dots of like trying to?
Yeah, I think people are busy. It's, again, there's, they're just in two separate databases. Yeah. And people are too busy to connect the two. And, it was at the block level. It came through scale, and scale might have come from multiple mills that traced back to a block that, and then you had section, it does get quite complicated, understandably, to kind of reconstruct, what I planned to harvest there versus, what I actually yielded off of there. The other important thing is, what the enhanced forest inventory is telling me is standing potential volume versus what I actually merchandise and take roadside are really apples and oranges.
Yeah, exactly.
And so people have said, well, those aren't the same numbers, so I can't feed them back. But I think, I take the approach, I'm not trying to improve necessarily that column that's predicting my before harvest volume. I want to add another field that is sort of, given, block size, species composition, type of equipment, contractor, time of year, and so on, what is my likely operationally netted down volume that I'm likely to get roadside? So yeah, they're different numbers, but add the column that has the different number that people really want to, they run their supply chains, they feed their wood yards, and they build up their inventories before breakup and all of that based on that column. And enhanced forest inventory has a flavor of that column, but it's not really what people want. So
yeah. Well, it's an interesting point. I always joke that it's easier to complain about something versus actually digging into it and really understanding what it's about, and then figuring out what to do with it. So yeah, definitely. So thinking of the EFI, and then before we maybe go more into your more recent work, obviously area based, we've heard the pixels. Thoughts on ITC in New Brunswick and where that's going?
Yeah.
Again, as the expert here, what do you think?
So the ITC we have used through the AWARE program, specifically looking at tree species prediction. And one approach that was used through the AWARE program was, and so the AWARE program was a large Canada-wide NSERC funded research program on really working with industry and understanding a series of specific questions that the industry had that remote sensing could provide an answer to. And one was on improved species prediction at the operational level. And then we did use an algorithm that was out of the lidar point cloud or a canopy height model segmenting individual trees. And it, it had benefits. There's a lot of additional work you need to do when you're building up your calibration data set. You're not dealing at the plot level. You're out there mapping individual trees, which obviously gets complicated and limits the sample size that you can generate. But once you get to about a 6-point data set, that seems to be, those algorithms seem to be capable of segmenting reasonably the number of trees. The other benefit we've seen of the ITC approach is back at the area-based approach, density is frequently one of the poor predicted variables. And even if the ITC is just taking a crack at counting how many trees you have in the point cloud within that plot, if you feed that in, it's at least giving it a little bit more information about how many trees you have in that plot, and maybe improving the density predictions at that area-based level.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely for our listeners that NSERC aware, lots of literature being published. Adam, you've been involved in some of those publications, as with other players. And in New Brunswick, JD Irving would be one of the industry partners, right?
Exactly.
Some of the obvious players there. And it was a great initiative there, and led by UBC, Nick Coops there. And
Exactly.
Again, small community there. Going to ask you, so I'm going to kind of role play against some of our listeners, like, Adam, I love lidar.
Yeah.
How many points do I need? What's the optimum point density?
Yeah. I mean, the optimum point density, the interesting thing about lidar is, and we get the question posed to us a different way in New Brunswick. The lidar is completely captured. When are you going to go back and do that again, right? And
good point.
Often the answer I provide is, we can't necessarily say today what the technology is going to be out there. There's the single photon in Ontario. The sensors are changing all the time, such that you can fly at a higher altitude and get a comparable point density or a higher point density. Ultimately, what's driving the cost of that lidar product is the fuel burn on that plane. So the higher altitude you can fly and get the point density that you want, that's really what you should be tracking. We've set up, going back to the Acadia Research Forest and the Petawawa Research Forest in Ontario, we've set those up really as test labs where, we can get multiple lidar captures over those areas where we can start answering some of these questions. So for example, at Acadia, we have a pretty good catalog of lidar now. We have a 1-point data set and a 6-point data set from 2012. We have a 6-point data set from 2015. We have a 6-point data set from 2018, and then we flew at 12 points per square meter last summer. So, we start to have, a spectrum of point densities there where we can start answering some of those questions about, what doors does a 12-point data set open for me over a 6-point data set? Is it statistically significant in my predictions that justifies the incremental, the incremental cost that I'm going to incur by going from a 6-point to a 12-point? The important
but at a minimum, what would you say?
Across Canada right now, 6 seems to be the minimum that everyone is standardizing on. Another important point I think about when it comes to lidar, and I think it's an important one, and maybe we won't realize it for a few years, but if you can cover a whole area with lidar, we've got New Brunswick in a can, right? We've got, the metaverse of New Brunswick in a point cloud, right?
You had to go there, didn't you?
I had to go there. I knew you'd want me to throw in some buzzwords.
Absolutely.
Like that. But there's questions that we're going to want to ask of our forest 10, 20 years from now that we're not asking today. But we may want to retroactively go ask those questions so we can understand how things have changed through time. And if if I were given the, the option of, this point density or that point density, I would think strongly about my budget and how high can I push that point density to future proof that data set in a sense. I know I can answer the questions I have today, but I could retroactively go into that data set and answer some questions in the future where I may have a higher point density, or the policy framework, the questions I'm posing of my land base are different in the future. And I want to keep those doors open, right?
Yeah, great comment. Yeah, future proofing. Yeah, absolutely. Pay a little bit more maybe if your budget permits to allow you that flexibility in the future. Yeah. So for our listeners, you're probably sensing this is a guy who's kind of been at this for a long time. Obviously knows his stuff and seen different things. I want to shift you a little bit more, because I know with the new role moving from the province to the feds, you've moved more into broader, like beyond lidar, not just lidar inventory. You mentioned AI and things. So maybe for our listeners, share with us what are some of those things you're focused on now. You touched on it in terms of the supply chain, but last time we spoke, I believe there's some reps from Environment Canada that were actually working with you, the CanMet team, or some other players. And again, the spirit that you build partnerships and whatnot. What are you guys working on now, or what are you guys thinking about?
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back to, and I guess I never did kind of, when at the start going through my timeline, I never did skip over to the federal government. So, I guess, I'd worked on, developing that program in New Brunswick, and, worked closely with Dr. Doug Pitt and researchers at the Fibre Centre at the time. And then, I think when Doug retired and they were looking for someone to step into that role, I was kind of, it was certainly a natural fit for me to move into that role and continue supporting what was going on in New Brunswick, but also kind of evangelizing what we had been able to do in New Brunswick and bring it to the other jurisdictions. The cross-country checkup is something that we continue to hold. So we have, about once a year or so, have, an afternoon webinar where every province kind of gives an update on where they are on their EFI or use of remote sensing. We take EFI quite broadly as a term, but where are they on that journey?
That's coming up too, right? Soon?
Yeah, that's next week, right?
Next week.
Yeah, I didn't know when this is getting posted, so I didn't want to date it necessarily. So
yeah. Well, definitely, we can look at Wood Fibre Centre, like Twitter, social media. You can see the link, but what day is it even today? 26. Yeah, so it'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. So for those listening, hopefully you've registered for it.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. My experience with the province, and then I remember in my interview for this role coming into the federal government, I remember one of the questions on the interview being, knowing what you know about enhanced forest inventory and the research programs that the Fibre Centre has, sort of what should be our next direction. And I remember distinctly saying, as I said, we've armed the forest sector with an incredible amount of rich, precise, accurate data at the operational level. But we're going to need to facilitate how that transformation happens, where they uptake that information and really transform the way they're making their decisions with it, so that they can see the full benefits of that information. And so that's what we've been endeavoring on, as you said, within the Canadian forests, sort of at the NRCan level, ourselves within the Fibre Centre, CanMet Energy, in Varennes, really focus on energy, energy optimization. They'll go into a pulp mill or an oil refinery, and all of the data streams that are coming over, all of the instrumentation in a big facility like that, and really optimize. Optimize. If you tweak your boiler by this amount, you're going to see a 10% increase in your energy efficiency and so on. And so, they're coming from the mill side, and it was natural for them to start reaching out into the wood yard and seeing how can we start optimizing the feed of the material going into the mills. And so They had a lot of experience in big data and artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so we kind of met together, and we've been working quite closely together.
Nice.
A couple examples, we took the 2018 Enhanced Forest Inventory in New Brunswick. Everything being equal, the inputs, the way the point clouds were dissected and the metrics that were generated, move away from random forest and try some deep learning methods, and really not tweaking the input, but trying a different algorithm. Can we squeeze any more mileage out of that data set? And on the enhanced forest inventory, it was promising. We got an improvement of maybe 10% on our R squares on basal area prediction, for example.
Nice.
So
nice.
So that was promising and a good example of how we could work together on a data set like that. We tried species as well. We saw some small gains when you looked at percent hardwood softwood, some broad species groupings. Once we got to individual tree species, it kind of suggests that we need to rethink how we're looking at that point cloud, or what sort of ancillary data do we bring in to inform it once we want to get to that resolution. That kind of convinced ourselves we had done as much as we could with the data we had. So yeah, we've been working a lot over 2 years. We had the workshop in February. A couple weeks later, we were all in lockdown, and it's been a struggle. Initially, obviously, the forest companies were just trying to keep their heads above water and figure out what this reality looks like. So it was probably a longer gap than we would have liked to in the dialogue between the sector and ourselves. But we got back on track. The supply chain is huge, and there's opportunities all along it. And in the conversations we were having with the sector, we had some emerging priorities, but it was hard for them to understand collectively where can we all put our efforts and where are we likely to see our biggest bang for our buck. So two engagements we did last winter. One was, what does that supply chain look like? And so we hired someone who did a process map, sat down with industry. On one end, I've got a year of harvest blocks that I plan to operate on. How do you queue them up? How do I do my pre-harvest surveys? How do I execute my harvest? How do I track my roadside volumes? How do I dispatch my trucking? How do I get things delivered to a mill, do my scaling and all of that at the other end? What does that process look like? Who are the players involved? What data do I need going into this step to make my decision? How good is it? How reliable is it? What data do I generate when I do that step? And what do I need to hand off to the next step? And I think it gave us a really good kind of high level understanding of where are the opportunities along there. As you said, I've diverged from enhanced forest inventory. EFI was seen as, we need to improve that going in, but the biggest opportunity was on the trucking. And how do I optimize my trucking to make sure that I'm not, 50% of the time they said, a truck is going down the highway empty because it doesn't know where to go next, or, there's no backhaul for them. But you start there and you start working backwards, and it's like, okay, I have these trucks, they don't know where to go because I don't have a good understanding of where my roadside inventories are, right? I don't know what volume is where in what products that need to go to what mills. So how do I improve that? Well, if I had harvester head data, and a way of tracking a little bit better what's in my piles, I'd have a better understanding of my roadside inventory. So then I could start optimizing that trucking, and then that harvester head data is kind of the linchpin to, I have it a high resolution, conceivably with a, precision GPS on the machine. I know what 20-meter cell that product came out of, and I know what that 20-meter cell was predicted to be. And then I can start building those feedback loops to make up those improvements in my predictions over time.
But I guess thinking of that, when you say that, Adam, harvesters, you see more on the East Coast, thinking of some of our listeners saying, yeah, but Adam, it's like, we're not using harvesters, we're using bunchers, feller bunchers. Yeah. How does that fit into the work you guys are doing? Or is that really one of those out of scope, we're focusing on this process and it's just the harvesters for now, or are you going to go after the processors?
So we've got some, I think, the complementary thing we have on the harvester head data from the single grips is as you said, from the feller bunchers and those sorts of machines. And FP Innovations is actually working on that side of things. So FP Innovations we work with closely, and they have some complementary programs that are feeding into this. One I would say is on, using cameras or a lidar sensor on that machine. So as you grab that tree in the feller buncher, it's scanning at least the bottom half and looking at the product recovery out of there. So it's a different way of getting at that. The other thing that ties all this in, a lot of, we talk about these things with folks, and their first commentary is, well, I'm way out in the bush and I don't have any cell reception. So how am I going to get all that data back to my office, right? And so FP Innovations actually gave a pretty innovative presentation back in the fall. They were out in the field in British Columbia. They've been experimenting with erecting their own cellular LTE towers at the harvest block, and then plugging that into a Starlink satellite system from Mr. Musk. And being able to, at the block level, wherever, being able to feed that data stream back into your head office and your servers, so that you can start analyzing that data in real time. So
very cool. Very cool. So I know, so lots there. And again, our listeners are, if you're, well, I won't say paying attention, I'm assuming you're listening because you are paying attention, but lots of nuggets here, lots of different technology. So maybe at this point, like we obviously we can't cover everything in an hour, but we're starting to touch on newer things. And so I'm curious to pick your brain for a few minutes in terms of, I've realized some international people are like, well, why would you pick his brain? Like, well, like, and so the sayings, I guess, sometimes don't translate when you're finally challenged on them. But if I was to get your thoughts, what are some of the trends you're seeing in the 1 to 3 year time frame? What gets you excited when you wake up in the morning? As you say, you go to your bunker and you start working on stuff. Are there certain macro trends or themes that you're keeping an eye on?
So one thing I've been given a lot of thought about, and I'm going to say these are a couple of things I need, that are on my mind. I don't have an answer for them yet, but yeah, they're down the road and I want to explore them. Obviously, decarbonization, forest as a solution to climate change, and all of that is top of mind. There's a lot of biomass that are going into electricity generation now and so on. And there's a lot of, discussion about, is that truly sustainable? Is that truly a carbon offset? And I want to think about using some of these supply chain tools, really to build that chain of custody, make it really robust. So I've burned a ton of biomass or a ton of pellets in a energy generating facility. I want to get a credit. I want to be able to demonstrate that ton that I'm burning is coming from a sustainable forest all the way back over here, right? And there's, on one hand of that, that's I'm burning this biomass and I'm not burning coal, right? But the coal is out there and someone else might burn it. That one's a little bit nebulous. But what I can build that chain of custody back to the harvest block, take it back to that EFI cell. With all of the, the harvester head data, go back that way through the mill, generate the biomass, go to a facility, burn it. All of the carbon that I'm producing, from the harvesting and the trucking all along. So, how much green is left in that pellet there? How do I minimize the trucking, the fuel consumption all the way along there? But really be able to say, this ton of carbon that this represents back to this block, I'm really holding on to this based on what I'm going to do in the future at that 20-meter cell, right? I'm going to regenerate that. I'm going to, I'm going to commit to in 30 years, I'm going to replace the carbon with tree improvement and advanced genetics and things like that. In 40 years, I'm going to do 150% of the carbon that I removed there last generation. And being able to have that transparency along that supply chain and being able to guarantee that and monitor it forward through time at resolution.
Very cool.
I've seen a couple of case studies where, the blockchain comes in as a tool to try to figure out how to track that and, how to map that and keep it transparent. And everyone has the information they need to be assured that, that ton of whatever I'm burning, or that 2x4 that I'm putting into a building, or so be it, whatever, the forest products that I'm producing, what is the legacy of that harvest block, where it came from, and what is it producing today that's offsetting the carbon removal that I made.
Yeah. So how far do you think we are from your vision? You think it's 10 years out, 50 years out, 2 years out?
The other thing, that I'll mention, that we've been having the conversations in New Brunswick, is if you want to build a system like that all along the supply chain, it's the collaboration of the players that you need along there. And so that's the other thing that we've learned over 2 years in New Brunswick. There's the technical approach, but there's also the organizing people, and making sure that people can work together to be able to produce that system. On the harvester, I'll go back to the harvester head data, but we're working with folks at UNB on developing data trusts. So if a whole bunch of harvest contractors working for forest companies on Crown land, and we all envision that we put all of our harvester head data into this common pool, what kind of governance do we need to put around the rules of that pool? Who contributes what? How does it get aggregated? Who gets what results out of there, so that everyone wants to put their information in there? There's a whole lot of other discussions that have to happen around digitalization that, again, is less on the technical solution, but is how are we going to organize ourselves so that we can function in these, complex frameworks, to make sure that everyone's on board to make that happen.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's fascinating to hear you make those comments, because there's definitely a theme as I talk with different people, that one, for people who don't know forestry, it is uber complex. And then two, yes, technology is a component, but in some respects, it's that change management and the people that are involved in terms of that journey, and to some extent playing nice, and everyone playing nice, and looking towards the finish line. So so I love talking with you, because again, other people I talk to, I got to poke them with the metaverse and the blockchain, and here you are, like, just bringing them up. And I know you've listened to some past podcasts, and I know a lot of people are like, what are these guys talking about? Why do I care? Like, I hear about Meta in the news, I hear about Microsoft acquiring Activision, Blizzard Activision, the gaming, and like, what does this all mean? And maybe there's a new world order coming to life. It won't happen overnight, but we're trending in that direction. So as we look to wind down, lots of topics we've covered here, man. It's like, so I want to try and bring it back to not the average Joe forester, in the sense that the forester is an average Joe, as opposed to for that person looking to start, whether on lidar, whether focusing, helping in that timber harvesting supply chain, or the AI, or we talked about ITC, we talked about lidar, individual tree area, like so many words. What's your pro tip for them to get off the sofa, if you will, all those excuses they may be bringing themselves on why they can't do it? Is there a pro tip you would give them to jumpstart them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're well structured now. We've got resources in place. So, through the Canadian Forest Service, the work of Joanne White, there's the best practices guides on development of enhanced forest inventories. Great guides to use. In terms of, if you want to start building an enhanced forest inventory, you don't have to do all the coding and art yourself through the AWARE program. And, there's the lidar package, which basically, gives you all the tools you need to do that, right down to the ITC, as well as a whole ebook on how to do that. Going back to the federal research forests, we've set those up really well to some degree. The super site at Petawawa and the work we're doing at Acadia, there's plots at hand, there's data at hand in different forest types across Canada. So you can actually, without having to go out in a snowmobile and do a bunch of plots, you can get your hands dirty with this stuff pretty quickly. There's all the legacy of the AWARE program, so you can go on that website and see all of the work that came out of there. Who were the collaborators? So if you're a student finishing an undergrad and this stuff's interesting, I want to do a graduate program, you can identify who are the top-notch professors out there across Canada who you'd want to reach out to. we're just starting our next 5-year NSERC program called Silva 21. Again, a lot in the same framework as AWARE. It's focused on silviculture and a change in climate. So looking at, what impacts are climate change going to have on our silviculture? How do we transform the way we do silviculture? But there's a lot of important questions in there that I would say are carryover from AWARE. Species identification, less at the broad scale, but I have 10,000 hectares of plantations that I want to clean. I want to find the fir and the hardwood in my spruce plantations. So it's still ITC, species prediction, but in a different context. So we're continuing to focus on those. And again, if you look up the Silva 21 program, you're going to see, really the community of people working on these things in Canada. And they're quite open communities, I would say. So if you want to reach out to anyone who's involved in those projects for more information, to learn what's going on in the projects, or as I said, you're an undergrad looking for a graduate program, you're going to find the resources just by poking around in those projects and find out who to reach out to.
Yeah, lots of resources there that you just shared to jumpstart people.
Yeah.
So, hey, this hour has flown by. I've had tons of fun. Well, one, catching up with you again. We haven't chatted, seen each other in a while, so super fun to see what you're up to. For those folks who want to get in touch with you, what's the best way? Is it email, website? I know you already talked about a couple of resources, but where do they find you? Where are you the most active? Are you on social, or how do they get a hold of you?
I think I use Twitter sometimes. I think it's at Adam Dick. I can't be sure. I don't know. Email is probably the easiest. And adam.dick@nrcan -rncan.gc.ca. It's a bit of a mouthful, but
yes, some things get complicated at the end of the day with emails and government. But
adam.dick@nrcan-gc.ca. Yep.
There you go. So that's the best way, folks. Again, super intelligent guy here with breadth of experience. You get a sense from that, from listening to him from the start. Studies, that spark, what then took him through doing some industry work into the provincial government, now in the federal government, driving some new initiatives for next generation forestry. So Adam, thanks so much for your time. Last thoughts to you.
Yeah, no, this is just a great space to be in. I'm really happy to be involved in this stuff, and it's I would say it should be kind of the envy of the forest profession in Canada, that we're taking a lead on these sorts of things. And it really it redefines the profile of a forester, and I think it's a good profile for the forester to have. Be able to dig into numbers and make better decisions. So.
For sure. Yeah, definitely the future for that young forester, even forester in the middle of their careers, and even the ones near the tail end of their careers. You just never know. There's great opportunities to innovate and bring about change. So my friend, thanks so much for carving out an hour of time to speak with me. I really enjoyed it. As I said, I wanted to catch up, see what you're up to. So thanks so much for your time, and be well. And we'll see you at some point on the circuit.
Sounds good. Hopefully. See you, Kevin.
All right. Thanks, Adam.